I think it's 10, so we'll go ahead and kick off. If other people come on in as we go, that's great. For everyone who's in here who doesn't know me, who haven't met before, right? Hey, I'm Jeff. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and we're going to talk about open source today. But I'd like to point out a couple things. So I am a software guy. I'm a software architect, cloud consultant. I'm actually recently installed member of the board of directors for the .NET Foundation. I wear a lot of different hats. But in addition to all those other things, I am also a lawyer. The good news is because these events are virtual, it's not contagious and you're not going to catch it from me. So like I can be a lawyer and you're going to be fine. I like to point out, not so much as a, hey, everyone, I'm a lawyer, but it's important to say this at the beginning of really any of my legal talks. If you've seen them before, you know what I'm going to say next. If not, you're about to, which is that I'm not your lawyer. Okay, that's really, really important. Not only to protect myself, but also to protect you. Okay, so I'm licensed in the state of Missouri. My license is technically, finally, after like 10 years of not practicing, I made it inactive this year. I'm licensed though, and to practice law in Missouri, I have been since 2004. I'm not an attorney who's licensed in the federal courts or in Kentucky or in any other jurisdiction. And most importantly, you know, your lawyer or your organization's lawyer is important. They're important to you. It's an important relationship. If you don't like your lawyer or you feel your lawyer isn't taking care, we get a bad rap, right? But if you don't feel your lawyer is interested in your best interests, it's the wrong lawyer. You should love your lawyer because your lawyer is ethically obligated to know the specifics about your situation and to take care of you and to put your interests first when they're working for you. I don't have that kind of relationship with anyone who's on here, even the people who are on this call or who are in this talk who I know. I don't have the details or the information to give real solid legal advice. So we're going to talk about legal concepts, okay? That doesn't mean you can't ask questions, but just recognize like I don't represent anybody here. Now, why does this matter? Why are we here? This is a technical conference with lots of really cool technical content. And some of you decided, hey, we're going to come and listen to a lawyer talk about open source and licensing for a little bit. Why? I argue that it matters because in the modern world of software development, open source is everywhere. I saw Chad put out a poll on the event platform earlier today, like what's your primary language? And like close to 60% have said C#. So there's a lot of .NET developers here in the room. Well, in prior years, a decade ago, 15 years ago, Microsoft, you wouldn't have said is a big open source shop. But if you're a .NET developer today and .NET Core, a lot of Azure tooling, that stuff's all open source. If you're a JavaScript developer, a Python developer, Ruby developer, in most ecosystems, it is hard to say that you would build modern software today without using open source, which means you need to understand what the implications of that are. You need to know what it means to say, I'm going to pull this library in over here and this library in over here, and this one's under MIT, this one's under GPL version 2. What does that even mean? And what does that mean for you and your organization? Okay, now, I prefer to start this talk, instead of, we're going to talk about individual licenses, okay? But I prefer to start this talk kind of level setting. We're going to talk about some definitions. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we're even talking about, okay? Usually when we're all in person, I'll like pace around the room and be like, hey, and I'll start calling on people and ask you all, like, what does it mean? When you hear the term open source software, what does that mean to you? If you have ideas for what you think it means to be open source, throw them in the chat because I am looking and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. I'm going to give like 10 seconds to see if anybody wants to type something and tell me what you think it means to be open source. I'm going to wait a couple seconds. Anyone wants to type? Don't be shy. Everyone's going to be shy. Oh, Sean. Sean says, OSS, source code is available to the public. Michael, the general public can contribute. Those are good answers. Anybody else? Cassandra, it's free. I always think about knowledge. Yeah, knowledge sharing, right? Contributions to the whole. These are great. I love the it's free. So Laura, thank you. So open source software means something very specific. It means software that you have received or that is distributed under an open source license. An open source license is one that specifically complies with an open source definition that includes a bunch of characteristics, most notably, although not exclusively, the 5 here you see on the screen. An open source license will always allow for free redistribution, will always allow for source code inclusion or require it, allows derivative or derived works, guarantees non-interference and non-discrimination. If a license that you receive software under doesn't have those characteristics, it's not an open source license. Okay, we're going to talk about each of those things in turn here to make sure we all agree and understand what that means. First off, free redistribution, Laura, that's right, it is free. It's free. Kind of. Okay, when we say it's free, what we mean is free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. Okay? Sometimes open source software is free as in free beer, but sometimes closed source software is free as in free beer. We're not talking about freedom of cost. We're talking about freedom of information. The entire free software movement, excuse me, which predates open source actually as a defined thing, was founded by people, activists in free software like Richard Stallman, who believed from the very early days of free software that if you are executing software in your environment, if someone distributes software to you, you take it and you're going to run it on machines that you control in your environment that are on your hardware, you should have the right to understand what that stuff is, be able to see and know what it is that you're executing. As a result, you should have the right to understand it, have free access to the information, free ability to redistribute that to other people, and as we'll see in the next point, freedom to access the source code itself. Okay, it's about understanding what it is that you're running in your environment and being able to see it. Freedom of information. Okay. Speaking of source code, I think most people, this is probably the one that comes most to mind. People say, oh, well, yeah, it's open source. I can go to GitHub, I can pull the repo and see the source code. Sure, that's great. There's a slight nuance. Okay, first off, it used to be in the earlier days when we actually distributed software on things like, floppy disks, CD-ROMs, whatever, that open source software would have the code, right? You'd have all that included along with the compiled binaries, the executables right there on that medium. These days, where most things are electronically distributed, it really means you have access at little or no cost to see the source code for the application that you've received that is open source. Importantly, I think most of us understand that this is not source code, right? Like all the ones and zeros, all the assembler or whatever else, that's not source code. But you know what else? This isn't source code either. And this is sort of an absurd example, okay? I know this is a big, huge, piece of garbage minified JavaScript. But the point is, just because I send JavaScript down and make it available in its form here, this is not the source code that I wrote the software in. Imagine I wrote a software application in TypeScript, and I compiled or transpiled that TypeScript into plain JavaScript. Making that JavaScript available, even if it's not obfuscated like this, isn't release of the source code. It's the TypeScript that I'm obligated to share with people. It is the actual code written by the contributors, by the authors, that has to be made available. The fact that it is compiled or transformed in some way to some other form, whether readable or not, is not the original source. And it's the original source that has to be available to you under an open source license, or that you have to make available to others. Derived works. That is interesting because derived works or derivative works actually is comprised of two different rights. First off, you have the right to modify things. So if I receive open source from you, I have the right to take that, see that source code, fix bugs, add features, modify it as I see fit. The open source license will not prevent me from modifying the code. And I have the right to redistribute that modified derived work that I've created from the original. So on the one hand, I can freely redistribute the pristine original library. I can also redistribute the modified thing freely, okay? The idea of distribution is really important when we talk about open source, because when you are consuming open source and then sharing software that you build with open source with the world, a lot of the obligations that you incur about making source code available and attribution and making sure, we'll talk a little bit about GPL and copyleft, all those requirements that you might have to deal with as someone who is using and sharing open source in your own products don't really come into play until you distribute something. And if all you do is take something and use it on your own machine and not share it with anybody, you haven't distributed or redistributed anything. If you work for a company and you take in open source software onto a machine that is owned by your company and you're an employee and you build a thing and it's only shared with other employees who are also working on company-owned hardware, you haven't really distributed anything. If you share it with outside contractors, with clients, with the public, now you have. And that is when you have to think, well, I redistributed software, so what obligations do I have as someone who's distributing open source? A place where this really comes into play is in the modern world with SaaS. So many things we use today are software as a service or platform as a service or whatever else. And when you're working in and publishing software in this kind of a model, you don't have to just think about who is getting the software. You have to think about which components are going out. So let's say that I build a piece of software and I build a bunch of backend services that I'm hosting in my own private data center on premises, or even hosting in the public cloud, somewhere like Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, in an environment that I control. Well, that stuff isn't being distributed most of the time. Most licenses say that the fact that I make those APIs available to outside parties doesn't mean that I'm distributing software. On the other hand, the HTML, the JavaScript, the web applications that I am serving down to the client that are executing on the client's machine, I have. So a single business application may include components that I have distributed out to a client and other components that I've not distributed because they're operating in the cloud or in a data center. Right? Same goes for mobile phones. Same thing, right? Backend services up top somewhere in the cloud, actual software distributed down to a mobile device. The stuff I've distributed might have different obligations than the stuff that I'm serving up under my own control. Okay. Non-interference. This is basically like be like Switzerland. Okay. You aren't allowed to have anything in open source software or open source license that interferes with the user's desired other use of their system. Here's kind of what that means. I'll give an example with kind of a chart here. So suppose I build some software and I'm going to use open source library number 1, open source library number 2, and then I'm going to pull down some code that I write myself. I'm going to combine and mix and match all this stuff, and I'm going to make a new distribution of open source software, and I'm going to share that out. Okay, nothing about some open source licenses may say that my new derived work must be open source. That's kind of what copyleft and GPL is all about. But nothing, not even in GPL, will restrict whether or not my new derived work can or cannot sit and run alongside other proprietary or closed source software. Nothing about it can control what kind of operating system or environment the consumer is allowed to use. I can't say, well, I'm giving you this software, but you can only use it in say, an open source like a Linux environment. I may build it that way, but if you take that software and want to use it and find a way to make it run in Windows, I can't stop you, right? I can't have my open source interfere with the other things you want to use in your environment. Okay. And lastly, somewhat related, is open source licenses are, by their nature, non-discriminatory. Now, yes, that means that nothing in an open source license can restrict or allow you to restrict who uses your software, but it also applies to the purpose and use of the software. So for example, suppose I'm a financial institution and I build a massive financial application, banking software, whatever, and I decide I want to take a component of my software, some sort of fancy calculator, who knows what, and I decide I want to share that with the world. So I kind of carve out and refactor this component of my software, and I'm going to release that under open source as an open source product. I cannot say in the licensing that you're allowed to use my software as long as you don't compete with me and use it in financial applications. You can use it for other stuff, but not for banking. That's discriminatory. If I'm going to open source it, anyone can use it, even to compete with me. So much so that the open source definition specifically says you can't even discriminate against evil purpose. Now, I know Harry Potter's going to be an older reference, but I love Harry Potter. I should replace it with something like Thanos now. I don't know. But once upon a time, Douglas Crockford, who's a luminary in the JavaScript world, tried to create a license that said you can use this for any purpose, but not for evil. And lawyers at Google, along with the open source initiative, said that's not open source. Okay? If Voldemort wants to build software and do horrible, evil things using open source, the open source license is not going to stop him from doing it. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not going to go to the wizard prison Azkaban. Okay? I'm not saying that you can use open source software for whatever purpose with complete impunity. That's not it. All I'm saying is that the terms of the license under which you receive that open source software will not stop you from using it for whatever purpose you like. But open source licensing, and licensing in general, has nothing to do with criminal law. Right? It's all about intellectual property law. Everything in the licensing world is about IP. Specifically in the United States, in Europe and many other places, the primary forms of intellectual property are viewed as copyright, patent, and trademark. Now, copyright, which is the legal construct that protects works of authorship, including your code, are the subject of the vast majority, if not all, open source licenses. I wrote a thing, I own it, but I'm letting you use it for your own purposes. I'm licensing, giving you rights over my copyrighted work. Some licenses, but not all, also give a license over patent. Patent is the way we protect novel inventions, right? Novel ideas. Now, there are different views in different parts of the world. Certainly it's harder to patent software right now in Europe than it is the United States, for example, but not every license in the open source world actually gives you a patent license. So if there's something in a larger library that might be patentable, you need to think about that, okay? What is not included in open source licenses are trademark, okay? So, which is how we protect someone's identity, their brand. So just because I issue software to you, let's say I work for a company called Worldwide Technology, or maybe we release something, okay? Just because I open source something and offer it to you in the community and you pull that in and use it, doesn't mean that you get to slap the WWT logo on it and use our trademark or assume our corporate identity or my individual identity. I'm not licensing that to you at all. I'm just licensing the code and possibly any patents, okay? Now, one last thing. Any questions so far? I keep kind of glancing. If there are questions, throw them up on the chat. If you keep seeing me look this way, it's just because the chat's over here. But I don't see anything, so we'll keep going. So, sale. Are we allowed to sell open source software? It's free, right? It's free. But as I said earlier with Laura, like you can totally sell it. Free is in freedom of information, not free as in free beer. Free speech, not free beer. So lots of organizations make a mint selling open source software. The reason for that is because the idea of commercial property and proprietary property, or commercial software and proprietary software, are not the same thing. Commercial software that is put into the stream of commerce, most likely for sale, can be open source or closed source. You can have open source software that is still made available for sale and purchase. You can have closed source proprietary software that's not open source at all that you can still give away for free. Sometimes these two terms overlap. Sometimes they don't, okay? Here's the trouble though. You can freely redistribute. So if I make open source software available to you and I sell it to you, there is nothing that stops you from taking that open source software the very next day and turning around and selling it for $1 less to everybody, or giving it away for free. I can't prevent you from doing that. That kind of restriction on redistribution would be a violation of the open source definition and a violation of any sort of open source license I might have tried to slap on the product. So how does that work then? I mean, how can we sell open source if someone else can just undercut us and give it away for free? Any ideas? I'll give like another 10-second period, like a little Jeopardy, Imagine Jeopardy music. Any ideas on how that works? If you have an idea on how we could do it, pop it on up in the chat. Looks like Laura's typing. All right, well, I'll keep watching.
Can it be included in other packages?
Say that again, I'll turn my sound up.
Can it be included in other packages?
Included in other packages. Sure, like included alongside proprietary software. That is certainly a way it can be done. Service models can, sure, right. Service models is a great example. So, hi Ken, by the way. Right, so I think there's a few ways you can do this. One is, and this is kind of tied to both what Ken is saying and what you said, Laura, is like, imagine an organization like Red Hat. Additional or customized support, Cassandra says. That's right. So imagine an organization like Red Hat. Linux, the Linux kernel is open source. But Red Hat Enterprise Linux is sold. People pay lots of money for it. Organizations pay lots of money for it. Why? Well, just like when you go out and you get a Starbucks coffee, if you're into such things, and you know that you're getting genuine Starbucks coffee and you got the Starbucks logo on there, this is why trademark is not part of the license, right? You don't get the license to say, hey, I'm giving you Red Hat Linux. I can redistribute the license. I can't use their trademark. If I buy Red Hat Linux, I know what I'm getting. I'm confident in the quality of that code. I'm confident I know who stands behind it. I know that I'm going to get support. I know I'm going to get security patches. I know that there may be warranty associated with that. There's all sorts of upsells potentially, all sorts of ways that I know that I'd rather have Linux from Red Hat than from Jim coming from Jim's basement. Okay? Or consider along the lines of what Cassandra is saying, right? Be like the Bobs. right? Offer consulting services. If you provide consulting services around the open source you're selling, maybe it's you're going to buy this thing, but in doing that, you're going to get this certain amount of support. Either how do you integrate this big thing into your existing infrastructure and networks? How do you, hey, you want to write some customized modules on top of it yourself? We're available here for some amount of time that we can help you do that, and it just comes with a purchase, right? The theme here is that I argue that you really don't ever sell open source software. Yes, you can sell it, but what you're really doing is you're plus-plussing the open source software. So if you think you're selling open source by itself, you're probably not, and you're probably not going to be successful. If you can put services and other things to add value to the open source itself, that is a thing you're really selling. Now, so I'm looking at what Sean wrote. Right, you have different versions. You can have enterprise and community versions as well. That's true. That's true. So, okay. Any other questions about that? Otherwise, we're going to jump into licenses. So Sean says, so OSS plus customization plus support is what is sold. Yeah, sure. I mean, you can look at it that way, right? Because what you're really selling is you're selling your expertise, you're selling your warranty, you're selling the customization support, you're selling all those other services, and the OSS is what it is that you are supporting. And so in order to sell the product itself that you've made, what you're really selling is all those other things that have been added on, right? At least that's my perspective on it. Yeah. All right, so let's move on. We're gonna talk about now the actual, like the nitty gritty of some of the licenses that we see every day when we use open source. First off, some of you may have seen or heard of the open source initiative before, OSI, opensource.org. Remember earlier I said open source software is software you receive under an open source license, which is a license that complies with the terms and conditions of the open source definition. Well, OSI think of them as like the standards organization. They're the foundation that sits on top of this, that are the gatekeepers or the protectors of the open source definition. If a new license comes into being and someone wants to consider it to be open source, that license gets submitted to these guys who will review it and make a determination. They are also not your lawyers, and they say so on their site, I believe. But these are the individuals or the organization who will review licenses and say, yeah, this qualifies. If you use this license, it's open source, which means at the very least, you know that it's going to allow source code inclusion, have non-discrimination, non-interference, source code inclusion, derived works, all that sort of stuff. Okay. Now, when you talk about another important concept, when we talk about individual licenses, they run along a spectrum from permissive to copyleft. Now, some of you may have heard the term copyleft before. Many of you may not. It's okay, we're going to talk about it. Copyleft is sort of the GPL side of the spectrum, and we're going to get there in just a little bit. But just know that in any given situation, an open source license, it's not one or the other, but it is going to be somewhere along a sliding scale of very, very permissive. A lot of people view them as easy to use licenses, perhaps, all the way over to copyleft licenses like the GPL. Now, what we're going to do here is talk about 4 main flavors of license: MIT, BSD, Apache, and GPL. And those 4 licenses or their families make up over 80% of the projects that are available on GitHub today. That's not to say there aren't plenty of others that are in a minority use case, but if you understand the principles of these major 4 and how they work, it'll really help you go a long way into understanding kind of how to look at an open source license and thinking about what you can or cannot do. And by the way, we're doing that in order from most permissive to most copyleft: MIT, BSD, Apache, GPL. Okay, so let's start with MIT. The MIT license is old. It's old. It actually predates the open source definition. It was used for free software, freeware, Richard Stallman era of the free software movement before there was a such thing as OSS. And it came, like many early software licenses, software licensing schemes, and software itself, came out of academia, specifically the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. The MIT license has a few different versions or iterations, but they all generally look like this. Now, normally I would stand in front of the screen and block you and say, don't read this slide. It's too many words on the slide, it's terrible, but there's a point. Don't read it all right now, seriously, stop. But this is a short legal document. This is a legal document, it's a license, and as legal documents go, this is basically a nursery rhyme. Like, there is not a lot here if you've ever looked at a contract before, okay? Basically, there's only 3 pieces to this in these 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph you're seeing is a non-exclusive list of some of the things that you can do when you use software that you have received under MIT. Things like copying it, Publishing or redistributing it, sublicensing, selling. Explicitly, you can sell this software. A non-exclusive list of some of your rights. Now that second part, the little 2 lines in the middle, that clause is an attribution clause. Even MIT, the most permissive of licenses, is still going to expect you to give attribution, which means that yes, when you take MIT licensed software and incorporate it into your derivative work or your product, you still are supposed to include the license file. You're still supposed to maintain the copyright language, especially larger enterprise-driven open source. You're going to open every source code file and you're going to see language up at the top that has copyright information about who wrote it. Don't remove that stuff, right? Like, don't take away people's copyright. Don't remove that. That's infringement. Don't do that. So many, and I know we all do from time to time. I know that like it's very easy to release software and not pop the license in there or make sure there's links in our mobile app back to the licenses that are available for the open source that we used. But it's wrong. That's wrong. I mean, we have to give attribution to the people who created the work that allowed you to make your thing. Always. Include the license file or link back to it in some way, and don't strip copyright from it, like ever. Don't ever do that. Okay? And then this last thing in all caps, because lawyers like to put things in all caps and we really want you to see it, even though I believe we do it because for me, it's way harder to read. So I think it's like, this is the most important thing, but your eyes just kind of gloss over it. Okay, this is important. There's 4 little letters in quotes there right on the first line of that paragraph, and they spell as is. It's a disclaimer of warranty. Okay, you're getting the software under the MIT license. I'm not promising you that it does what you think it does. I'm not even promising you that it does what I think that it does. But that's okay, because you can see the source code, and if there's something wrong or doesn't work the way you want, you can fix it. But don't come at me and tell me, well, I thought this software would do X, and it really did Y. It is as is. I'm not warranting anything to you. Which, by the way, remember, is part of why when you get enterprise type license or buy open source from companies like Red Hat, those additional warranties that might come with the software are important. Because the open source in and of itself, probably isn't going to promise you anything. Okay, so that's MIT. Related to that is BSD. Now, BSD stands for the Berkeley Software Distribution. So now we're on the West Coast of the United States. BSD might even be older in its original form than MIT, another very old license out of academia. The Berkeley Software Distribution was a Unix-like OS distribution from the University of California, Berkeley, out of Cal. And there are several versions of BSD, and they aren't all the same. The easiest way to think about this is there's a 2-clause version, a 3-clause version, and a 4-clause version, right? Aside from any like introductory and conclusion stuff, you're going to have 2, 3, or 4 like numbered little paragraphs in the middle. The 2-clause version is very similar to MIT. It's, at the very least, you have to give attribution, and there's a disclaimer of warranty. If you see the 2-clause version, you can basically treat it as though you have MIT licensed software. The 3-clause version adds another provision that we call the non-endorsement clause, non-endorsement provision. What that says is that if I take your software in under the 3-clause BSD and I produce a derivative work with it and release it, I cannot use the name or likeness of your organization or the individual contributors in promoting and endorsing my product without your express consent. Now, on the one hand, you might think, well, why don't I want my name out there wherever possible? People want to like throw my name on a thing. That's great. Yeah, maybe. But what if you make amazing software and I pull your software in and I put something together with it and it's garbage because I write horrible software. And I release that and then I promote it by saying this was made with all this stuff that Cassandra did and like it's amazing. And then all of a sudden people look and go, well, gosh, this is not good. Cassandra must write really, really bad stuff. Well, that's not fair, right? What she made was awesome. What I made wasn't. So I shouldn't be allowed to pretend or make it look as though her work is an endorsement of my own. Okay? Lastly, the 4-clause version is a bit problematic. It has the advertising provision. The advertising provision says something that almost sounds like the exact opposite. So first off, it feels conflicting, but the advertising provision gives a very specific phrase. If I try to quote it, I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm not going to quote it, but you can look it up and find it. The advertising clause says that in your promotional materials, if you put out ads or put things online, or back in the day, you buy a $10,000 full-page ad in MSDN magazine or whatever, you have to include the following language, effectively acknowledging that your software was made with, not endorsed by, made with software written by X organization, X individual. This became very onerous because as we had a proliferation of open source over time, and we have longer lived libraries, and you have tons of contributors, and this becomes very challenging. Tracking who all the contributors are, and then giving in your advertising materials, putting what looks like a huge Oscar acceptance speech in there of all the people who helped make this possible, basically means you're putting all these names on there, and there's no room to actually promote your own stuff. It's deemed to be onerous, difficult, and organizations, enterprises don't like it. Generally speaking, you won't see the 4-clause BSD anymore, but you will sometimes. So if you see BSD, at least open up and make sure that you don't see this 4th clause in there. If you do, you might want to try to avoid it. It's generally not advised. Okay. Now, these are both academic licenses, right? These are licenses that came about at a time when software was being written on punch cards with giant machines that filled rooms, right? This is older stuff. At a certain point in time, I already kind of hinted at this a little earlier, at a certain point in time, some things started changing in the world of software and computer science, and we had patents, which led to trolling. Right? We have cultivated an environment, and again, in some parts of the world, this is a bigger problem than others. But we've cultivated a scenario where organizations or individuals acquire huge numbers of software patents, squat on them, and then go after people and sue them or try to extort money out of them, all these different things to make sure they own the intellectual property. So then for you to use this thing that's very important to your software, you're gonna have to pay them effectively a fee to have the right to use these patents. Now, the trouble is, remember these earlier academic licenses, I know that I said open source says that there can be no restriction on sale, resale, redistribution. And in fact, open source along those lines, it's supposed to be royalty free. The trouble is we're not talking about copyright here, we're talking about the patents themselves. And MIT and BSD are silent on patents. So the Apache Foundation came along and they took what was their original license that didn't speak about patents, and they basically threw it out the window. And they came out with Apache 2.0 license, which is the primary version of the Apache license you would see today. And the Apache license, this does not look like MIT. It looks like a legal document. I mean, there's number provisions, defined terms, all sorts of stuff. But the most important thing that the Apache license did is it provides an actual patent license. It explicitly says, in addition to the copyright license you get, anything in this software that is subject to patent or may become hereafter subject to patent, you get a license to use that as well. With the caveat that there's a provision that the technical term for this is a patent non-assert clause or patent non-assert provision, but we call it like a poison pill, okay? Which says, I'm giving you the right to use my patents, but if you turn around, because the law is like, especially in the United States, the law for who has the right to the patent is first to the courthouse steps, first to file. So if I haven't filed patents and I'm giving you the rights to this thing, and you turn around and you try to claim patent and reassert patent rights to prevent any other contributor back upstream or prevent anyone else from using patents, your rights immediately terminate. So I'm giving you a patent license, and for you to try to come around and stop anyone else from having patent rights, you lose. I don't have to sue you or stop you. Automatically, it happens immediately. You assert a patent claim back against other authors, and you lose your right to patent. This is a good thing, actually, because it makes sure that we are staying and keeping things open for everybody across the ecosystem, and that nobody, especially patent trolls, are going to take advantage of others in the open source community. Okay? That's the main thing in Apache. The other kind of noteworthy thing in Apache is there are requirements around change logs and things that you're supposed to maintain. So it is worth, if you use Apache software, just being familiar with what those requirements are. Okay. Lastly, GPL, free as in freedom. Okay, sure. That's true. The GPL in all of its various flavors, this is actually pretty important. I mean, this is all important, but this is important, is a copyleft license. Now that's not bad. So remember, when I say it's not bad, I'm saying that now so that when I say some things in the next several minutes, you think, gosh, it seems like you're saying this is bad. It's not bad, but it's different. Copyleft is the principle that if I create something that is open source and you consume that open source, which I may be licensed to under some form of GPL, your derivative work that you create must also be released under the GPL. So if you create a derivative work with my GPL license thing, the thing you made is open source. And the things that other people make with that is open source. It is open source forever and ever, amen. Now, if that's what you want, that's great. Okay, I mean, really. And there is a time and place for that to be exactly what we want in the open source community. If what you are is a big megacorp or an enterprise that is trying to use open source software and create proprietary software from it, sure, the library we use is still open source, we're going to redistribute, but the thing we make with it, we don't want to share all that source code. Well, then copyleft is a real problem for you. So in a lot of ways, even though we say free as in freedom, or people say GPL is the most open of all open source licenses. Well, I mean, that's true. But going along with that means that by being the most open, it is also the most restrictive. Okay? In other words, this is guaranteeing open source software to everyone in the world forever, and that's great. But that means what I can do with it to close other things later, can't do it. Okay, now, I see a question from Laura. Can you change the copyleft later or remove it? No, and that's exactly the point. So, and that's what makes it copyleft, right? So use as a counterexample the MIT stuff, Laura. So now I'm looking at you and I'm not looking at the thing. So I'll look back here, sorry. But use the MIT as a counterexample. I'm gonna take something that uses MIT and I'm gonna dynamically link this MIT library into software I build. The thing that's MIT that is unmodified, right? I got that under MIT license. I still have to give attribution. I still have to give that license and share that license file. That thing itself is still open source, and I can't take that openness away from that thing. But all the other stuff that I built that uses it and links to it, I can strip away any open source, and that thing can be a closed source piece of software. And the only stuff that has to be open is the stuff that was open in the first place. The difference with copyleft with GPL is I bring in a GPL library, I write all my own code, my own libraries, and this one dynamically links even, right? Connects to this one because I referenced it. I opened up NuGet and pulled a package in this GPL, and now I'm tagged to this thing that compiles with it. All this other stuff I wrote is also open source, and it's all under GPL. That's what makes it copyleft. The thing that not only can I not remove the copyleft later from the GPL license thing, the whole thing I made is copyleft. And then when I do that and I put it out there and Sean gets it and he wants to use my thing and he makes something with the library that I built, his thing becomes open source, right? It's some people term it like a viral open source license. The problem with that, especially in 2020, but the problem in general with the idea of calling something viral is that it adds a negative connotation for sure. And like I said, there is a time and place when copyleft is exactly what you want. But in the enterprise, building closed source proprietary software is not that time or place, okay? Now, there's a few other things you need to know about GPL. Unlike many other licenses, say Apache, there's Apache 2. You're not going to see the old version of Apache anymore. You're really not going to see it in the wild. But there are several versions of GPL that are substantially, kind of like BSD, I guess, substantively different licenses that are all still very common. Even though there's a version 3 of the GPL, version 2 is still as common, I think maybe even more common today than GPL v3 if you look across the entire ecosystem of open source software. Now, GPL version 3 did a few things over its predecessor. For one thing, unlike version 2, version 3 added some of the Apache stuff. So version 3 of the GPL gives you a patent license, and it includes that patent non-assert clause, that poison pill. That is part of GPL version 3. It's not part of GPL version 2. If you get version 2, there is no patent license. GPL version 3 also explicitly closes kind of a loophole. So if we go back, remember way earlier in the talk, talking about what distribution or redistribution is, and I said, imagine a world where you've got services hosted up in the cloud people are accessing, and then you have the thing you distribute to the client or the mobile device or whatever. And the stuff up in the cloud, most people would say, and general practice is that those things are not distribution, only the stuff that you actually put on the other person's machine. Well, GPL version 3 explicitly says that to be the case. GPL version 3 closed that argument and said, if you are just making services available in a data center or cloud environment that you control and people are accessing that for their own software, you've not distributed and you're safe. Okay. LGPL, the lesser general public license, the GPL is a general public license. The lesser GPL is a license that a lot of people refer to as a weak copyleft. It is still a copyleft license, except if all you do is pull an LGPL library into your software and dynamically link there's no static linking to this library. There's no direct modifications. You're not distributing a derivative work that is an actual direct modification to that original code. You're just bringing in an LGPL library so that you can use it, so that you can call its APIs through your own software. And you're doing nothing more. Then this other thing over here that is simply dynamically linked is safe from the copyleft provision. So that can still be closed source or issued under some other licensing scheme. Anything you do over here is still fair game. So anything you do to that LGPL library still has to be released under an LGPL license and remains open and remains copyleft. But it at least protects the stuff that's only dynamically linked. Okay. And lastly, the AGPL, the Affero GPL, is a license that does exactly the opposite of what GPL v3 said, and says, yeah, if you're actually running APIs and all you're doing is exposing those to outside clients and you're just running those in a data center or in the cloud, doesn't matter. That is actually still distribution. So even the services that you are running in your cloud environment and just exposing to others, that is distribution, and you have open source those things. And by the way, they're open source under AGPL. Thank you very much. So the AGPL actually is probably the most restrictive of all of these. Okay, so, right, wow. Sean says, wow, right, yes, wow. So again, if that's what you want, great, but okay. Another consideration of GPL is compatibility. So not only do we have to worry about which version of GPL we're using when we have a copyleft license that's brought into our code, but you have to ask this question, okay? Can code under license whatever, MIT, Apache, Mozilla, whatever, can the code under that license be combined and redistributed with code covered by GPL? What's being asked here is the GPL license doesn't only say that everything is copyleft. And so if this is under GPL and you make something with it, then it's all under GPL and still open source. It also says that you can't add anything else in that adds additional restrictions on your consumer that make it harder for your consumer to use than what the GPL allows. So there can be nothing in this under this other license that conflicts with the terms of the GPL, because the new thing you build is going to be GPL, not just open, but is going to be GPL. Give a couple examples and maybe help explain what that really means. Because the problem is that it fails. If license X fails this test, then you can't even combine the two. You can't take the GPL license code and the X license code and put them into the same derivative product, because doing so would violate the terms of the GPL. Full stop. So for example, take GPL version 2, the older version of GPL, which I told you already doesn't have any of the patent stuff in it. Okay. The Apache license adds a patent license. Now that's giving additional rights to the consumer, so that's good. It also has the poison pill provision that says, but if you do this, then this bad thing happens. And that's a bad thing that isn't in the GPL v2. That's bad, because now we're adding more restrictions on what the consumer can do that GPL doesn't permit. And so because of the poison pill provision in the Apache, what that means is that code licensed under Apache and code licensed under GPL version 2 are not compatible. They cannot be mixed together at all. You cannot make a software application that uses both. Take the 4-clause BSD. That is the one that has that advertising provision with the Oscar nomination speech or whatever, where you have to thank everybody whoever helped you make this software. Take the 4-clause BSD and any version of GPL. They are not compatible because the GPL in all of its flavors does not impose that advertising restriction or requirement. So by adding something new that puts a new requirement on the end user that GPL would not allow, those two things aren't compliant, because when I re-release the thing under GPL, the 4-clause BSD stuff is no longer there, and they can't be put together at all. Now, all that being said, just because things are compatible doesn't mean you get to pick and choose. So MIT and Apache, for example, are both compatible with GPL version 3. MIT, in a lot of ways, MIT is kind of like the type O blood, right? Like it's the universal donor. MIT is permissive enough that it can be combined with most things. Apache has the patent and the poison pill stuff, but that's okay because so does GPL version 3. These 3 licenses are compatible. However, just because they're compatible doesn't mean that I can now re-release my combined derivative work under MIT. I cannot. It's still copyleft, and it will still, my derivative work will still be GPL. Must be, because the license requires it. Questions about any of that? Okay, cool. We're doing pretty well on time. So Now we've kind of talked through what open source even is, and we've talked about the major licenses. Let's take a step back and think about the considerations that you need to actually bear in mind as a developer that is either thinking about producing and offering open source, or maybe more importantly, as the employee or leader in an enterprise that is consuming or possibly consuming and contributing and redistributing open source. What do you need to think about when you do this? There's a handful of major things to keep in mind. First, how about contributions? Cassandra said way back at the beginning when I said, what is open source? And she said something along the lines of, I always think about the contribution from the community. Right. That's an important part of what makes open source valuable. So if I work for, Acme Megacorp, and I'm going to use open source and publish open source, first off, when I publish open source libraries, do I want to accept contributions from the community? I mean, just because I open source the thing doesn't mean that I have to accept your pull request. I can open source a thing and you can fork it and do whatever you want. And if you want to contribute back to my library, I don't have to take it, right? Or similarly, if you're in that enterprise setting and you are using a library and you or your team or your employees say, hey, I did this thing and I would like to contribute it back up to right? Not publish something new, but I pulled in a library and I made some changes, I fixed a bug, and I'd like to contribute that back to the community. Well, what does that mean when I actually contribute that, when I submit the pull request? What does that mean to the intellectual property that's owned by my organization? If you've contributed or participated in any way before, excuse me, in larger kind of enterprise corporate open source, there's a very good chance that you've either heard of or seen or even signed a CLA or a CAA. Sorry, Sean, no questions now, but there's a lot to consume. I'm hoping there's a, well, Sean, you have more learning resources because you can literally call me. We can talk, but yeah, we can get to that. Okay, so the CLA and the CAA, they are very similar things. One is the contributor license agreement. One is the contributor assignment agreement. Sounds the same, looks similar. Both are basically saying when I make a contribution, if I'm going to submit a pull request and give it back, I'm also agreeing in exchange for my right to be allowed to contribute to that library and offer my contributions and submit a pull request, or for people who want to submit license contributions to me in a repository that I control, if they sign a CLA, in exchange for their right to give me a contribution, they are licensing that intellectual property to me. They're guaranteeing that by submitting that intellectual property back to the repo, back to the community, they're affirmatively saying that I'm licensing any of my contributions back to the original copyright holder so that we don't accidentally end up with a case where most of this is open source, but somebody's retained some sort of intellectual property that they haven't really licensed out to the public. The distinction with assignment is that assignment is a fancy lawyer word for transfer. So a CLA and a CAA are very different in that one key respect. A CLA, I retain the intellectual property, I retain the copyright, but I'm promising that I will license it back to the community and to the repository. An assignment agreement is I'm going to make a contribution, and in doing so, I am foregoing my rights, and I'm transferring all my intellectual property rights in perpetuity to the repository, and I no longer own that intellectual property. I want to make a contribution to the community, and I'm going to assign my contributions back up to the repo and the maintainer. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to know what it means when you do it. Okay, what about when you find a library online? This is great. I found this awesome thing. It's going to be just what I need. And you say, I wonder what license it's under, and you can't find the license file. Like, you don't know. Sean, so contributing to the .NET Core is CAA. I believe that is correct. I think that the majority of Microsoft-owned libraries right now require you to sign a CAA. I believe that is right. Not all necessarily, but most, many. Yeah. Good question. So what if I can't find a license? What does that mean? Far too many of us say, I guess I can use this. No, right? Just because you found a thing on the internet doesn't mean you can use it, right? Like, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter if that's on GitHub or if that's on some person's blog or I just found it in a Google search. If I find software and code files, I can pull them down and there's no license associated with it, then the intellectual property remains completely vested in the individual who wrote the software. And my taking that code and pulling it into my software and redistributing that is infringement because I've taken someone else's work and I've used it for my own gain and distributed it without their permission. The intellectual property belongs to the author unless they license it to me. That's part of why GitHub changed several years ago when we create a new repo, they're like, what license do you want to use? And they try to force your hand and really encourage you right off the bat when you create a new repo to pick a license scheme. Because if you don't have one, theoretically, no one can use your thing, okay? Do you know who backs this thing, right? Is this, going back to the idea of like, is this Red Hat Linux? Is this .NET Core and you know that Microsoft stands behind it? Is this some open source library that is controlled by one or two people? Is this, like in the .NET space, is this AutoMapper that belongs to Jimmy Bogard? Like, you know, or is it someone you have no idea who it is, right? Well, if you don't know who stands behind it, is that okay? I mean, maybe, but you need to understand that. And when it's always good to know like who is really standing behind this thing and produce this thing that you're using, because you need to know, again, it's probably as is, but you at least need to know where to look to get support and ask questions if possible. What if the thing just dies? Like what if the repo goes away? That could happen for a lot of reasons. People's lives change, their family situations change, their jobs change, especially open source that is produced by one or a small handful of individuals. Like maybe that person just gets bored. I've been doing this for 6 years and I'm tired of it. And they just go away, hope someone else takes it over, but I'm not going to be further supporting this thing. Well, okay, if that happens, do you have a plan? Does your organization have a plan? Are you prepared? Right? Are you prepared to do you want to take up the reins? Right? Does your organization have what it takes? If you have a library that is essential to your work and the core maintainers go away, are you prepared to take up the reins? Now, I mentioned at the very beginning, like, so I've recently become a member of the board of directors for the .NET Foundation. One of the things our foundation does is we try to help with this particular part of it, right? Because member projects can apply and become part of our organization. And one of the things that we do is assist with the administrative stuff. This is mostly in the .NET community, right? Not exclusively .NET projects, but mostly, where we try to make sure that we ensure continuity and help with the legal administrative aspects that the average developer may have trouble dealing with. But not every community has that, and not every organization is able to do that. So you gotta be prepared, okay? And none of us really has a crystal ball, but you need to try to have one. Because what if you're making a tool today and you think, I know this stuff's GPL, I don't care. This is a proof of concept thing. I'm gonna build a little application, it's a demo. Maybe I'll distribute it to a handful of other employees around the team, around the company, but this is an internal tool. I'm not giving it to anyone, no one else in the public's gonna see it, so I don't really care that it's GPL, it doesn't really matter. Well, are you sure? Are you sure? How confident are you that you're not ever going to have an eye to taking this thing you've built and 6 months or a year from now sharing it with the broader community because you think there's value out in the outside world, outside of your organization? How sure are you that it's never gonna become so popular that your organization decides to divest it or to try to sell this intellectual property to a larger organization that wants to take it on? And is some other organization going to pay you for that product or be willing to take it on if you have a whole bunch of GPL licensed code that is intrinsic to the thing that you've built? So you can't really predict the future necessarily, but you need to think about it and think about what the whole life cycle of this software is going to be when you start at the beginning, to the extent that you can. Now, all that makes it sound like that open source is bad and dangerous, and it's not. We're not going to, please don't try to build software without using open source. It's silly. Like, don't solve problems that people have solved. You're saving time, you're saving money when you use open source, and realistically, like, you have real business problems that you're trying to solve. Focus on building software that does that, and all the technical stuff that sits behind it. When other people have solved those problems and solved them well, sit on their shoulders and use that stuff. Okay, it's not that it's bad. It just means that you need to be aware of what it means when you use the open source software, and it means that you need to have some sort of a plan. Now, there's a lot of tools to help you with this. I don't work for or represent any of them. You know, there's Black Duck software, White Source software, a couple other organizations that offer very comprehensive tools to audit, you know, your whole solution and give you reports. Those reports are usually pretty good, pretty accurate, but those tools are very expensive a lot of times, and those tools are sometimes alarmist and make things sound scarier than they really need to be. Now, if you're in a huge enterprise setting and this is your like flagship product, investing in some automated tooling to help you keep track of all your open source is probably a good idea. Okay, I'm not here to say that you should or shouldn't use them or which one to use. It's not a bad idea, but at the very least, what you should always do is focus on teamwork. Even if it's the smallest project that's going to be used for a small audience, you always should be including your team in the discussion of open source, and you should do it from the very beginning. What I mean by that is, Laura, I see that you have one other question. We're in the last couple minutes of the talk here anyway, but then I will get to your question. Okay. So when we talk about teamwork, what I mean is, for example, when I start a new project, if I have any control over that project, or even if I don't, I try to get the people who are in charge of the project to sit down and talk to me about, let's start with like a thumbs up, thumbs down list. At the very least, let's start there. Say, look, let's talk about open source. Let's make sure everyone understands what's at stake and why it matters. Let's talk about what the purpose of the software is and what we think we're going to do with it. And as a result, why we have to think about open source and our use of it. And then let's say, hey, look, when you're trying to solve a problem and you do a search and try to find a thing that might help you with this problem, and you see, oh, here's this, and it's licensed under blank. Is that a green thumbs up blank license, or is that a red thumbs down license, or are we not sure? So maybe we know that we're doing something that's proprietary, closed source, big enterprise stuff, and we know that copyleft just isn't going to work for us. So GPL and all of its kind of copyleft brethren are on the thumbs down list. Please don't use them in our software, and here's why. And if you see something that's MIT or is 2 or 3 clause BSD or maybe Apache, we know that's fine. If you find something that's in one of the sort of more marginal, lesser known licenses, it's not necessarily wrong. It might be fine, but hey, before you use it, if it's not on the yes or the no list, let's talk about it. Let's discuss it as a team. Let's make sure and see if we can take a few minutes to research and understand what this license means and where it falls on the spectrum of permissive to copyleft and whether we're okay with it or not. It forces the conversation. You're providing tooling and an understanding to your team, not only through having open and active discussion, but you're educating your team to make sure everyone understands that, like, this is a big deal. Open source is great. It's great, like really, but as with all things, there are consequences of using it. And so by forcing that discussion early, you could create a culture where everyone understands and thinks about this. Not only how can we use it, but like, what does it mean for our team and our organization? And if you include everyone and you give them the right tools, whether those are automated tools or just a thumbs up, thumbs down list or some other form of teamwork and conversation and open lines of communication to have this dialogue, like first off, maybe if I have to solve a problem really quickly and I look and the very first thing I see is GPL, at least I've had the conversation. I say, you know what, I remember that this isn't going to work. And maybe I'll look at the second hit in Google before I just make a decision, instead of just grabbing the first thing I see, which could save us a lot down the line. And really, most importantly, everyone is all in, right? If you include everyone in the conversation, people are going to feel a sense of ownership and a sense of the sense of importance of why we have these conversations and why the open source discussion is a meaningful and valuable one. Okay. So where do we go from here? What kind of things if you're in violation of these licenses? Yeah, so we got a couple minutes. Bottom line is I'm going to answer both those questions. So first off, look, have a plan and understand these things, right? And like I just said, include your team in all the conversations, because when you do that, you empower everyone to not make mistakes, right? Now, what do those mistakes mean? Danny just asked, what types of things can happen if you're in violation of one of these licenses as a company? Well, there's a lot of problems here, right? Because these are contracts. These licenses are legal obligations. When I decide to use software as an employee of an organization, that organization produces software that uses GPL, and then I violate the terms of that or any other contract, I'm in breach. I'm in breach. I mean, if I steal someone's code and don't give attribution, that's infringement of someone's IP. But even if I follow those rules, but then I decide to try to close source a thing, or I try to sneak by and use GPL software in something where I shouldn't, and I try to close source something I'm not allowed to close source, I'm not going to say it's easy to be discovered, but there are certainly cases where it is discovered. And when that happens, I mean, you can be sued. The organization can be sued. It's not necessarily, it can be harder to sue for monetary damages because it can be hard to assess exactly what the monetary damages are. But at the very least, the original owner, like GPL, library maintainer who owns the intellectual property can sue you for an injunctive relief, which is basically to say, hey, I give these people software under certain terms and conditions. They violated those. So, Your Honor, I need you to tell them they can't use my stuff anymore. That's really, that can be very expensive in and of itself, right? If you're using something that it's not easy to find another way to do it, and now you got to rip your software apart and start over, and you have to immediately cease and desist distribution of the software that's in violation of the GPL while you try to solve the problem, that can cost, I don't know, thousands, millions, while first off, your software is out on the market for a while because you aren't allowed to continue distributing it, and while you invest in trying to figure out how you're going to solve the problem a different way because you violated the terms. There are examples of that. There's a company that's a client of Worldwide Technology where I work. It's not because of anything that WWT did, and I'm not going to tell you who the client was either, but there was a company that got burned on that. Built some software with another vendor, built a thing, and then they got burned. And they didn't get sued for lots of money, but they actually ended up coming out of pocket and paying huge amounts of settlement money. I mean, very large sums. of settlement, we say, look, we understand, we're sorry, and we'll try to fix it over the next. You have to fix it anyway because the next person's going to come along and try to sue you too. But you're going to give us a break for the next 24 months while we solve this problem. And by the way, we're going to pay you all this money just to drop the charges, let us go so we can do this thing. It was very expensive. So I'm not trying to scare anybody, but like there are real consequences of violating the terms of these things if you don't understand them, which is why you should make sure that you understand and your team understands. Laura, how much do you need to change the code to make it your own? Well, that's okay. So that's interesting. You mean like to make it no longer the open source library? Is that what you mean by that?
If it's
So really, by and large, if the real answer is you're always adding on to someone else's stuff. And so yes, you have copyright over the thing you produced and your own modifications or contributions, but unless you're literally taking like one line of it and building something completely new with it, then you could maybe argue, look, I found this one line of code, but then you're not even using the software. If the core principles that underline the piece of software that you're utilizing are still there, if it's a library to do X and it's still a library to do X, and then you've just written a whole bunch of new stuff to it, whether it's bug fixing or adding new features, all sorts of other stuff, the original core of the thing that was still there is still the property of the original author, right? Something can be more than one person's, I guess is really the answer, right? The software that was written by the original maintainer, original author is still theirs, and then you've added substantial contributions maybe to that same source code file, and those contributions belong to you. And you can have multiple copyright. These pieces belong to this person, and those other pieces belong to that other person, and that's fine. But it doesn't become yours. Like you don't suddenly become the owner of someone else's work because you changed it enough, right? It's more you've added additional contributions which are yours, and then the initial contributions were theirs. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right, we're like at 11:01, so I don't want to keep people from going to the next session. If there are more questions, I don't know if this chat stays open or not. Like I said, you can always send me a chat, tag me in the general event chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on that through the day as I can. I'm at Jeffrey Strauss, Jeffrey, 2 syllables, not 3, not Jeffrey. Jeffrey Strauss on Twitter. My DMs are open. You can always reach me there. I'm pretty much an open book. So if you need to reach me, don't be afraid to touch base. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your Code PaLOusa. Thanks so much for joining. Oh, Sean says it's lunchtime, so I'm welcome to go if I want. That is true. Except I have promised my parents, who are giving me a very brief respite here, who are watching my children right now, that I have to go pick them back up now. So I can stay for a few minutes if people have questions, but not super long. So that's fair. Are there other questions?
Stop pressuring him, John.
Yeah, no worries.
No questions.
All right.
Thank
Everyone
you.
enjoy the rest of the event. And let's make the most of this crazy virtual world we're in and go learn stuff for the rest of Code PaLOusa. Thanks, guys.